Thank you very much for attending the Veil of the Great Storm King with our speaker, Christina Richter, tonight. This is brought to you by the Renaissance Society of Sacramento and our additional partners, Friendship Force, Sacramento River Delta Historical Society, all the historical groups that are here. I'm really pleased to have Christina Richter join us this evening. I have been working with her. I worked with her when she was out in Roseville as director of many programs out there, including she'll correct me, the Placer Historical Society. She's been working on projects for Fittimet Farm. She has written a book about the Donner Party, which she will express later. We also serve, we did serve for a little while on the County Historical Society. She's also the regional vice president for the Conference of California Historical Societies. She is everything history. She's doing 3 talks for us this session, including one that will be coming up on Roseville. We have many members that are joining us, we hope, from Eventbrite. So thank you for joining us. You are going to be able to ask questions through the chat, or you're going to be able to raise your hand at the end. For now, I'd like to throw it over to Christina.
Thank you, Mary Ellen, and thank you, Kathy. It's great to be here again. I really, truly appreciate the opportunity to talk about history, and this particular story is near and dear to my heart. One of the best quotes that I have seen in doing some research is when an anomaly occurs, an aberration, something so extremely out of the ordinary, a veil descends and behavior is no longer normal. And we kind of know that in today's environment, don't we? But in particular with the Donner Party, that's exactly what happened. This veil came over them and things were no longer normal. But first, before we dig right into that part of the presentation, how the Donner Party got started was this feeling of manifest destiny. And that was our God-given right. So we thought and we felt very strongly at the time for us to actually conquer this continent that we had come to know. So before 1845, we had primarily fur trappers in the West, and there were traders, fur trappers. Of course, the land was owned by Mexico, and there were land grants. But this manifest destiny is what drove us to the West. So digging into the actual history of the party called the Donners, of course, they were the Boggs Party first, we know that there's a lot written. And as I expressed to Mary Ellen before we began, it can get rather complicated. I had chosen to take this from a family's point of view and focus on that. And I'll tell you why. I learned a lot when I actually wrote this book. And I wrote this with David Fittimet. And the Fittimets are an old pioneer family in Roseville. And the neat thing about this family is they have roots that just go in all different directions. One of them is with the Donner lineage. And I have to tell you, I was thrilled when I first started to research this part of the story. Walter Fittimet, who is this gentleman standing right here in front of his original Roseville house. Of course, that wasn't Roseville at the time. It was way out in Timbuktu. This is an 1885 picture, by the way. His wife is Ella Bond, and Ella Bond is where the Donner lineage came through. Ella is this cute little gal here. This is 1877 when she was 22 years old. And she grew up hearing stories of the Donner Party. And she understood about the entrapment, and she understood about the horrors of what happened, and also the relief of when they were out, and of course the family as it grew after that entrapment. But keep in mind, when she was growing up, it was all word of mouth. So we know how that can be. We know a little bit more now about what really happened, but you can imagine the tales that she grew up with. So here's her lineage. Ella married Walter. You remember David is the gentleman who I worked with on my book. And Ella married Walter, and Ella's mom was Frances Bond. So Frances is the niece to Tamsen Donner. Frances and Tamsin were actually very close. When Tamsin married for the second time, she married George Donner. Frances actually babysat a lot. I think she actually lived with them for a while. And she was super, super close with Tamsin Donner. So when this party decided to come west, Frances actually wanted to go with them. But fortunately, her father absolutely forbid it. She came out later, and that's a whole nother story, but we're happy that, of course, she stayed home in Illinois. So what got these guys started when they wanted to look at this manifest destiny and what was going on with the West were some writings that were going on at the time. There were letters from traders and trappers. There was also a Captain Fremont book. The most popular one, of course, was this one by Lansford Hastings. And what would happen is neighbors would gather in the Donner's house at night, and Tamsin was very well educated, and she was able to read accounts of the day, and she read Lansford Hastings accounts and Fremont's accounts and all of these letters that were spinning around. And after they discussed it for a while, George's brother, Jacob Donner, and he both decided they're going to go. They decide they're going to head for California, and they actually take out an ad. And this was not unusual back in the day, that there were ads for parties getting together. People, they needed young boys to actually drive these wagons. So there were also these glowing editorials strongly advocating this immigration that was going on to the Pacific coast. There was another person who became interested at this point in time as well, and his name was James Reed. And I'm sure you all recognize that name too. So in the Springfield Journal, March 18th, 1846, the thing that strikes you will be, it won't cost you anything to actually come west with us. And they were able to attract quite a few people to actually join their party and work with them. Here's who made up that initial party. George, who was 60 years old at the time. And I don't know about you, but 60 years old and going west, wow. I mean, that's something. He had always been a wanderer all of his life and an explorer. And his first wife passed away, and he met Tamsin, and they were married. He had 2 daughters from a prior marriage. And then with Tamsin, he had Frances, Georgia, and Eliza. And then, of course, there's Jacob Donner, who isn't much younger. He's 56, and his wife, Elizabeth, in their family. And then you have the newcomer, James Reed, who's 45, quite a bit younger relatively, and his wife, Margaret. And she was 32 at the time. So one of the recollections is, there was a lot of actually recollections, but the Donner girls did a lot of reminiscing in the years after they got out of the entrapment. And one of the things that they told us was that as time went on, our preparations were frequently interrupted by social obligations, farewell visits, dinners, and other merrymakings with friends and kindred far and near. Thursday, April 15th, 1846, that was the day, and it was fixed for our departure, and the members of our household were at work before the rosy dawn. We children were dressed early, and as the final packing progressed, we often peeped out of the window at the 3 big white covered wagons that stood in our yard. Can you imagine these 3 huge wagons in their yard? So the first wagon that they had, they stored all the merchandise that they were actually going to use in California. They weren't going to touch that until they got west. The second one were all of the provisions that they needed for their camping, their tools, their clothing, anything for camp life. And the third one was the family home on wheels. And this actually had feed boxes attached to the back for the saddle horses. So at noon, the family wagon was ready to go. The 2 wagons before had already left, or the first 2 wagons, I should say. And then it hit all of them all at once. And one of the Donner girls writes later, there came a pause fraught with anguish to the dear ones gathered about the homestead to say farewell. Each tried to be courageous, but not one was so brave as father when he bade goodbye to his friends, to his children, and to his children's children. And of course, we're speaking about George Donner here. I sat beside my mother with my hand clasped in hers as we slowly moved away from that quaint old house. As I glanced up, I saw tears in her eyes and sorrow in her face. I was grieved at her pain, and in sympathy, I nestled closer and soon fell asleep. So they're on the trail, and they have joined up with some other people at this point in time. And Tamsen is actually reflecting that it's fairly easy up until now. They're 200 miles from Fort Laramie. They have a total of 518 wagons in this huge caravan that the Donner group has joined up with. And Tamsen is saying, these are the details, and everything's going just fine, but we do have some problems with our wagon wheels. That was our first clue, and that they might have to stop at some point and actually fix them. And also buffalo chips. They had finally discovered how to properly cook their meals because they didn't have any wood out on the plain, on the prairie, and they used buffalo chips. Here is their trail. So Independence, they start out on May 12th, and they travel and they get to Fort Laramie. And Fort Laramie, they arrive actually June 27th, 1846. And they decide to hang out for a while, rest up their oxen, and they celebrate July 4th here. In their time at Fort Laramie, a gentleman by the name of James Clyman comes to visit. And he's an old mountaineer, and he knows what's going on. If you can imagine, he was part of the fur trappers and all of those original people going west. And he had actually been writing with Lansford Hastings. He didn't like what he saw. He didn't like what he saw at all. And he told the immigrants to avoid this Hastings cutoff. It's not a good route. You don't want to try your luck. Just avoid it altogether. So they listen, they stay until July 4th, and then they continue on. Well, July 17th, they're at Independence Rock, and the company encounters a lone eastbound rider. And he has a letter from Hastings, and he's urging all of the immigrants who are now on the road to meet him at Fort Bridger so that he can guide him on his cutoff. So the letter carrier was paid by Hastings, but probably a well-kept secret, or one of those little known facts, is Hastings was working for Sutter. Sutter wanted people to come to California, as many people as possible, because of course he's building his little empire, not little empire, his big empire out here. And he wants to lure as many people possible. So even those who thought they were going to Oregon, Hastings' job was to persuade them to come to California. So here we go. We have the parting of the ways. The company had reached the Little Sandy River, and there were other wagon trains that were camping there. And this is when they gathered together and they had big discussion, and they decided, we're going to split up. We've got the one group that want to go and take the Hastings cutoff, and they elected the George Donner to be their captain, and the Donner Party is officially formed. And the other folks, they separate. So the Donner Party takes the left-hand road to Fort Bridger, and the rest of the party turns right. So we have the parting of the ways right here, which I think is a great little map here that we can see what's going on. So I believe I do. Yes, I do. So there's a journal entry on one of the immigrants' diaries that we know that we have quite a few of them now. And the July 20th journal entry reads, the Californians were much elated and in fine spirits with the prospect of better and nearer road to the country of their destination. Mrs. George Donner Tampson was an exception. And it's interesting that they took note of her. She was gloomy, she was sad and dispirited in view of the fact that her husband and others could even think of leaving the old road and confide in the statement of a man of whom they knew nothing, but was probably some selfish adventurer. She had these guys pegged early on. She was an amazing woman and an intuitive woman. So we reach Hastings cutoff, and 5 days later, let's see, the Donner Party reaches Fort Bridger, and they're expecting to meet Lansford Hastings. But Lansford Hastings sends an agent instead, and Hastings has left, and he's gone on, he says, to pilot another immigrant train through the cutoff. But he's left instructions. And he said that all arrivals should follow his trail and that they would find an abundant supply of wood, water, and pasturage along the whole line, except for a stretch of maybe 30 or 40 miles at most that was a dry drive. Well, the party had stuck around for a while. They rested their oxen and they come upon the Great Salt Lake. And this is quite a problem because they don't know that they're going to go through, they didn't know that they'd have to go through these mountains, they'd have to create their own trail. Hastings never shows up for the Donner Party, but he does point out through an agent that an alternative route to get them through a rough part of the canyon is available, and they show them how to do that. So sudden fear of being lost in the trackless mountains almost precipitated a panic. The party's not doing very good at this point. And my father and other cool-headed persons kept excited families from scattering rashly into greater dangers. Of course, they all want to leave at this point. And they had been 30 days in reaching the Great Salt Lake, and it was originally estimated it would take 10 or 12 days. People are not happy at all at this point in time. So then after the Great Salt Lake, they reach the Desolation Utah Desert. This is hugely difficult. Hastings is saying there's 2 days, 2 nights, hard driving, you'll cross the desert and then you'll reach water. And they knew it would be a heavy strain on their cattle. They paused for a bit, about 36 hours before they decided to cross this. And they left camp on the morning of September 9th and entered the dry drive. They represented it being initially 35 or 40 miles. Can you imagine being out here in the middle of nowhere? This was a region that it's just desolate. So Stanton and McCutcheon, 2 members of the party, had ridden ahead to Sutter's Fort, and it took them 6 days to cross it. They lost 36 head of cattle. And at this point, they were just so downtrodden. It was clear that they couldn't turn back. And there's a lot of reports and diaries of them cursing Hastings. They were just incredibly upset at this point in time. And a side note, for many years, people traveled through this desert later on, and they just found artifacts all over the place. The Donners and many of them just completely abandoned that first wagon with the provisions that they were supposed to use in California. So once they crossed the desert, it was good traveling, but their spirits were just super, super low. Native Americans were threatening their campsite each night, and cattle was being stolen. There was always a risk of that. One fateful morning, and it was October the 5th, the cattle became mixed up when 2 wagons were starting their teams to escape the Native Americans. Both drivers were provoked. Reed was one driver and Snyder was the other. Snyder began to whip Reed and hit his wife in the process. Reed responded by stabbing Snyder. And it was all just a series of quick, sudden, responsive actions. Snyder was dead, and then they banished Reed from the group. One of the settlers or one of the immigrants had written, "It was plain that the hardships and misfortunes of the journey had sharpened the tempers of both men, and the vexations of the morning had been too much for the overstrained nerves." These guys are not doing very well at all at this point. So they continue on and they reach the Truckee River October 16th. It's getting pretty late in the year at this point. On the 19th, Stanton actually returned from Sutter's fort. He has new provisions and he has 7 mules. And on the 22nd, the party crosses the Truckee River. But then something horrible happens. The Donner party wagon broke and it was an axle, and little Eliza, the youngest, little 3-year-old, was almost killed in the process. She was thrown from the wagon. And George is attempting these repairs and his hand is crushed. And he is in bad shape at this point, and it's October 31st. It is late. So now we go into the storm, and they call it the Storm King. The Donner wagons are behind the Breen family wagons, of course, because they're trying to fix the wagon. The Donners are, and George is hurt. The Breen family reached Truckee late at night. And then during that night, it started to snow on the summit. And then word reached the Donners that the snow began to fall. And now everybody's super, super depressed. The Donners hurry to join the others, but they do get stuck. And they're almost 5 miles from everybody else on Alder Creek. So here is one of the first reminiscing sessions with young Eliza when she's recalling later on. And only a child would see this when everyone else is so depressed. No one observed the picturesque grandeur of the forest-covered mountains, nor that eastward and southward it looks out across plateaus to the Washoe Mountains 20 miles away. A piercing wind was driving storm clouds toward us, and those who understood their threatening aspect realized that 21 persons, 8 of them helpless children, were there at the mercy of the pitiless Storm King. I can just imagine this young child. She's caught between being afraid, but she's a child, so she's still looking in wonderment at everything. So here is an artist rendering by W. Murphy of what they think the camp at Donner Lake looked like in November of 1846. Of course, the immigrants were trying to make it over the pass, but there were 5 to 10 foot drifts of snow, and they just couldn't find the trail. So after they ventured out, they ended up back at Truckee Lake, and they began to set up camp. Everybody was there except for the Donners. And the Donners were about a half a day's journey ahead of, or behind them, sorry. On the evening of November 4th, it began to snow again. So here we have at Truckee Lake, 60 members and associates of the Breen, Graves, Reed, Murphy, Keysburg, and Eddy families. They're all here and they're trying to set up for the winter. They find these cabins of pine logs with dirt floors and poorly constructed flat roofs. Of course, it leaked when it rained. Another thing that Eliza is recalling later on is that the snow was falling faster and in larger flakes. And of course, this is where they are at Alder Creek. It made pictures for Georgia and me upon the branches of big and little trees. It nestled in piles upon our buffalo robe. Everything within our quarters was cold, damp, and dreary until our tired mother and elder sisters built the fire, prepared our supper, and sent us to bed, each with a lump of sugar as comforter. So here's what the map looked like. Here we go. Between the 2 camps, when it was super, super deep in snow, it was a full day's traveling between these camps. When the weather was the bitterest, Eliza recalls that the smallest ones were kept in bed. And on December 17th, 17 people attempted to cross the summit. They arrived at they called it an Indian village on January 12th, but nearly half of them died in the attempt. And finally, January 10th, the conflict of the Mexican-California War is over, and the Treaty of Cahuenga is signed. So finally, men and supplies are freed for a rescue attempt. And of course, this is January of 1847. And by the way, for those of you who know this story in more detail, I have skipped over some of the attempts to cross and how they cannibalized each other and that sort of thing, because I'm trying to keep this from the perspective of what the girls saw. So one rescuer, this is an ad that was taken out January 16th in 1847. And there are immigrants in the mountains, and they know this, and also realize that people back east who are their relatives are just hearing that there are immigrants or people who are stuck in the mountains. And they begin to wonder, are these our relatives? Because we haven't heard from anybody in months. And so the word is getting out. One rescuer recalled they gave the alarm that the people would all die without assistance. It was 2 weeks before any person would consent to go. Of course, they were tired from the war. There were people stuck in the mountains. But finally, we concluded we would go or die trying, for not to make any attempt to save them would be a disgrace to us and California as long as time lasted. They were tired. They knew the mountains were covered with snow, but they decided that they were going to go anyway. And John Sutter, he tried to sweeten the pot, and he offered $3 a day to anybody who would join a rescue party. Finally, on February 3rd, a public meeting was held in San Francisco. They raised funds and they organized a party, and the local citizens made generous donations. And at this time, there are things being written in the Eastern papers about what's going on in the West. And these people are stuck and they must be dying. And they're questioning. The San Francisco Star on February 6th reports that a company left the day before. And this is the first relief. And they left Johnson's Ranch to head out to the immigrants in the mountains. On February 7th, the second relief was organized in San Francisco, and guess who's leading that party? James Reed, thank heaven. So now remember that depiction from a couple of slides ago. This is what it looks like now. This is, again, an artist rendering, obviously. And the relief party shows up, and the lake is completely frozen and snowed over, and the snow is about 13 feet deep. And the Donner girls recall later, oh, how we watched hour after hour with straining eyes, scanning the desolate expanse for one moving speck in the distance, which should ease our awful suspense. They thought, at this point, we shall go mad, and we shall die. Finally, that first relief reaches the lake on February 18th. And this is what Eliza wrote later on. It was a long, weary waiting on starvation rations until the 19th of February. I did not see anyone coming that morning, but I remember that suddenly there was an unusual stir and excitement in the camp. 3 strangers were there, and one was talking with father. The others took packs from their backs and measured out small quantities of flour and jerked beef and 2 small biscuits for each of us. And the 2 older Donners from George's prior marriage, Elitha and Leanna, they actually left with this first relief, and the young ones were still there. So the first relief rescuers left the camp with 23 refugees. The second relief rescuers left Johnson Ranch for the mountains, and the 2 parties actually encounter each other on February 28th. Remember, Mr. Reed is leading the second relief. And because those rescuers had taken his family, he is reunited with his wife and 2 of his children at this point in time. You can well imagine that must have been absolutely incredible. On March 1st, 10 men from Bear Valley reached the lake camp, and the second relief party from Johnson's Ranch arrives a day later. 31 of the company were still in camps, nearly all of them children, and they were unable to travel without assistance. So Eliza remembers the last food which I remember seeing in our camp before the arrival of the second relief was a thin mold of tallow, which mother had tried out of the trimmings of the jerked beef brought to us by the first relief. So the 3 young Donner girls are to go with the second relief, and Tamsin incentivizes them and gives them valuables and cash, and she's very, very generous with the second relief party. But those people, they travel to the lake camp from Alder Creek, and the guides decide not to take them, and they leave them in the lake camp. So this is where I came upon a fascinating part of history. The family that I wrote about, the Fidament family, actually had original letters, or have original letters from the Donner girls when they were corresponding later on in life. And I think there are 5 or 6 of them. And this one in particular is amazing. In my book, this is right from my book, this historically revealing letter between the Donner sisters and their adult life was written in January of 1894. At the time of the entrapment in the winter of 1846-47, Eliza was the youngest at 3, Georgia was 4, and Frances was 6. Now, an excerpt from the letter is what is the amazing part. So Eliza is being written to by Georgia, and she says, Eliza, God has chosen you to act many hard parts. I am thinking about the time when Keysburg was bending over the bed with arms outstretched. And remember, the little girls are now stuck in that lake camp. And she's thinking about the time when Keysburg was bending over the bed with arms outstretched, saying, Eliza, you will sleep with me tonight. And Frances holds her little hands tighter, clasping. You nestle close against her bosom while she speaks. No, you want to kill her. I have always believed that your life was spared by her efforts, for he walked away as if overcome by the words and actions, and you seemed to realize you had made a narrow escape. You can imagine that I read this letter quite a few times. It was just amazing to me. So going forward, a total of 41 passed away in the mountains. 48 survived. 2/3 of the women and children survived. All 4 of the Donner adults died, and most of the Reeds and all of the Breens survived. And the Donner children are finally taken to Sutter's Fort. So this is the relief that arrives on March 13th. They are rescuing all but Tamsin, George, and Keysburg leave. On April 17th, the 4th relief arrives, and Keysburg is the only one left alive. On June 22nd, 1847, General Stephen Watts Kearny is heading east with the Mormon Battalion veterans. He gathers all that remains of the lake cabins into the Breen cabin, and they burn it to the ground. The bodies that are there are all buried. And the one thing that they think happened was that there was money sewn into some of Tamsin's quilts. And they do believe that the children were clothed in those quilts, but they left them behind, and then they were burned. So here we are at Sutter's Fort, and this is a rendering in 1846 of Sutter's Fort. I do believe I have this. Let me see something here. Yes. So Eliza recalled later on that neither fear nor misgivings troubled us little ones the morning we started out hand in hand to explore our new surroundings. So they're at Sutter's Fort. They've been through the worst, and they're finally so happy to be there. They know that their parents are going to be coming, and they're out exploring and seeing what it's all about. We had rested, been washed, combed, and fed, and we believed that father and mother would soon come to us. Often we looked at each other and exclaimed, how good to be here instead of up in the snow. I'm sure that this was something that they remembered just so vividly for all of their lives. In May, a party arrived at the fort, this is Sutter's fort, with horses laden with many packs of goods. But their only refugee, was Louis Keseberg. So realize that this last party were there to clean up in terms of what they thought was a fortune up there, what they thought were hidden treasures, et cetera, et cetera. And they actually had forced Keseberg to show them where some of the Donner treasure was buried. And he did that, and he was brought back to the fort in chains. But that evening, back to the children, someone came to our door and spoke to Elitha and Leanna, the two older girls, in low tones and went away. My sisters turned, put their arms about us, and wept bitterly. The cruel, desolating truth was told. No weary waiting would ever bring father and mother to us again. So at this point, they're realizing that they are orphans. Also, what's happening is back east, the survivors are being listed in papers back there, and their relatives are getting word that there's a huge problem that happened with this immigrant party. So in Sacramento, you have Mr. Sutter and you have Mr. Keseberg, and this is May of 1847. John Sutter is not happy about what's going on in California, and he's not happy at all about the Americans taking over and what his future is not going to be anymore. And out of spite, he defends Keseberg, and he protects him. And I don't know if you know this or not, but Keseberg eventually, actually shortly after, opened up a restaurant on K Street in Sacramento. Isn't that awesome? So the Donner girls went to a woman by the name of Mrs. Brunner, and she took them in. They called her grandma. Let's see, in early summer of 1849, word from family in the East finally reached the girls. They were looking all over for the girls, and they actually engaged the governor to find them. And Eliza wrote, one day, the postmaster a letter addressed to ex-Governor Boggs, and Governor Boggs personally brought the letter to Mrs. Brunner, I'm not sure. We did not understand all it said, but enough to know that it had been written by our own dear Aunt Elizabeth, who wanted Governor Boggs to find her sister's 3 little orphaned girls and send them back to her by ship to Massachusetts. Can you imagine these little girls and what they'd been through? And now the family wanted them to board a ship to go back to Massachusetts. And of course they did. They were concerned about them, but they didn't realize, the folks back east, that the little girls had found a good home and they were situated well. Mrs. Brunner explained to the ex-governor that we did not want to leave her, nor would she give us up. She said she and her husband had befriended us when we were poor and useless. And so then the governor wrote back to Aunt Elizabeth and told her how fortunately the little orphans were situated. Here are the 3 girls in their older life. Eliza is the one who actually recalled the most and did the most research. And I'm guessing because she was the youngest, it probably wasn't as horrific for her as the other 2. They were a little bit older. They were a little bit more comprehending what was going on. They all went on with their lives. And Eliza actually wrote a book. She did a lot of research, and it was called The Expedition of the Donner Party. And I've done a lot of quoting from this book. It was originally published in 1911. And of course, this cover is when it was republished, and I believe it was 1984 when they republished it. One of the things in this book is Eliza talked to Keseberg a lot. And I don't know if she talked him into it or if he was just bent on not telling her the truth. But because there was rumor that Tamsin, her mother, had been eaten by Keseberg, she wanted to disprove it. And she swears in this book that Keseberg did not kill her mother or eat her mother or any of that. However, of course, when they found Keseberg, there were many mutilated bodies, and among them was Tamsin's. So while she wanted to believe one thing, probably another happened. But again, the recollection through the eyes of a child, you have to take that into consideration. News of the harrowing tale of the Donner Party made its way across the United States. And for the next year after the tragedy, Western immigration just dropped significantly. And of course, we know what's coming. The gold rush is coming. So it all started all up again. And that's, of course, another story. Historians described it as one of the most thrilling, heart-rending tragedies in California history. So just a little comparison. We were in Serene Lakes, which is the old ice lakes, in the winter of 2016-17, where there was 150 inches reported on March 8th, 2017. And this, this was getting into the cabin that some friends of ours had rented, versus about another 100 inches that fell in 1846-47. And they estimated that based on tree lines. And there we have it, the veil of the great storm king. And that is the end of my part of the story. And if you have questions, we'll see if we can get them answered. And by the way, I love it when people actually can tell part of their knowledge of what had happened, or maybe they have some family stories that have come down. And if you want to share those, that would be fantastic.
So Christina, thank you very much. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen, it'll be easier to see everyone, and then we'll have Jan Washburn ask the first question. Great. So Jan, hold on just a second. I'm going to get your camera. You can now start your video and unmute. And Jan, you still, yeah, there we go. Thanks.
Oh, I didn't have my hand up. I mistakenly hit the button. I'm sorry.
Oh. Okay. We did have a question, and I noticed this as well when you were going over the list. This is Elizabeth Donner was 45. She had a 1-year-old, and if I remember, Tamsin also had a young child. They had older husbands, but they were you know, still in their 40s. They look like they married fairly older to begin with. They would have been in their 30s before they married. Do you know much about their life prior to the trip, and much about the women before?
I know the Donner story, and I'm certain that somebody in this audience knows the story of the rest of that party and their background. If anybody wants to chime in on that. I'm not hearing anything. All right.
Yeah, we're not hearing so far. But was it? I mean, it seems like with the infant mortality rate, to be that old and to be having child seems a little unusual to me. I have to tell you that surprised me. Marty McNew says, and I would be willing. Who is Governor Boggs? What state? Because California doesn't have a Governor Boggs and wasn't a state until 1850.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know the answer to that. I think that he was a Mexican, so quote unquote governor, but I am not sure. You know, we have some folks answering the questions in here too.
Okay, we have somebody saying, and I'm going to check that one because it's really possible. I understand that Marysville was named after a member of the Donner Party. Can you elucidate that?
I'm sorry, say that again. I was just reading these.
Marysville was named after a member of the Donner Party.
Yes. Okay, is Ron Grove in the audience? Because he is quite good at all of this. And I see that he's written a little note to me. Ron,
Yeah, I
are
was
you
gonna
there?
say, yeah, Ron, if Ron, maybe what you can do is if you can answer any of that, it would be wonderful.
Yeah, the Boggs was the governor of Missouri, and he had been persecuting the Mormons. One of the reasons the Mormons left Missouri, and all along the trail, they were actually more afraid of being ambushed by Mormons than they were by Indians back then. But Marysville is named after Mary Murphy from the Murphy family. When they originally came down to Johnson Ranch, she married Johnson of Johnson Ranch. All the girls, there was no women in California, so everybody was married like within months after they came back. And they eventually separated because he was abusive and married another man whose name I can't remember. And they went to set up the town of Marysville and named it after her. So Marysville is named after Mary Murphy from the Murphy family in the Donner Party.
Thank you. And Ron, do you know anything about the story of the Donners before, especially the women before they left on the trip?
Yeah, Tamsin Donner was in North Carolina. George and Tamsin were both widows. Tamsin was a teacher. She had, in 1 year, her husband and son died from illnesses. She came up to help her brother in Springfield, Illinois, after his wife had died. And while she was there, she met George Donner, and they married. I think Jacob was a widower too. I'm not quite sure. So it was rare for the women to die before the men back there, but at that time, but well, even now, but yeah, with all the illnesses and things they had back then.
Great, thank you. And I feel like this is a stupid question, even though I know you're going to say there's no stupid questions, Christina, but why was it that they were not able to get everybody out at once where they would have left Keysburg? And weren't there some suspicions about him?
There were a lot of suspicions about him.
To
And
have
then,
left him with 2 people, why weren't they all taken out on that last one and 3 remained?
Ron, do jump in on this one too, but from what I understand, they could only take out so many, and they put priority on the youngest, the weakest. Now, as far as Keysburg, I'm not sure why they left him behind. I know Tamsin and George were stuck. George was dying, and Tamsin refused to leave his side while he was dying. And once he did pass away, she wrapped him up, and then she walked to the camp. Now, maybe Keysburg stayed behind because he knew that she was coming. I'm not exactly sure. Ron, do jump in on this one too. Ron and I are buddies, so. Yeah.
Keysburg hurt his foot and couldn't walk out. He was unable to get out.
Thank you.
So that's why they left him there. And then when Tamsin came down, his story was she fell in the river, ironically, probably Donner Creek, and caught pneumonia. Well, then she died, but he did admit to eating her. So
did he admit in some accounts?
The accounts of the people that came up said that he had admitted eating her. He I guess had gone to the camp and taken some of their money. So when they came on that last relief party, which was basically a salvage party, you get to keep half of what you find. They wanted him to tell them where her money was. And he wouldn't tell them until they threatened him. He had a rope around his neck. And he said he was just saving it for their children. So it was all very suspicious.
Very suspicious. Mm-hmm.
So I will notice that Larry Borio says that Boggs was also involved in the Mormon massacre. Did anyone want to comment? Did you mention anything about the Mormon massacre? Ron, did you want to add anything so that we know a little bit more? Or Larry, did
Yeah, Larry would probably know. I know that Boggs had been persecuting them in Missouri. And so there was a lot of anti-Mormon sentiment. That was the original wagon train. He was in the original 500 wagon train that they were in when they came across the country.
So I'm going to ask a question of the audience in a strange way. For those of you not born in California, when we were growing up, what we always heard about was the Reed doll. I mean, it was kept. That was the story that we read. The rest of the Donner story was kind of, I hate to, it was glossed over because it was a little bit too gruesome. But I'm wondering, those from other states, if you heard about the Donner Party in your own educational, when you were growing up, or when you became aware of the Donner Party, and why your interest, because not only did we have large enrollment in Christina's today, but we have another talk on the Donner Party. So anybody want to make any comments about what you knew about the Donners? No one
I'll
wants
make
to.
a comment. I'm Marlene.
Thank you.
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Oh, thank you.
But when I was growing up, California was like another country.
Mm.
We heard about the gold rush. We heard about the Spaniards, the Mexicans being there. We heard about the gold rush. I don't remember anything about the Donner Party. And it was only when I moved to California and I drove across the states, and I remember going on Donner Summit and the plaque they have up there. I was a teacher at the time, and in order to get my certificate to teach in California, I had to take a history class at Sac State. So I ended up learning about the Donner Party when I got to California.
Interesting.
That was in 1971.
Good. Did anyone else want to make a comment? Victoria noted that Nadja West trilogy really deepened her interest in California history. We are hoping that Nadja is going to be one of our speakers in the fall, if not a pop-up earlier. We have asked her, so thank you for mentioning her. Trudy, you have your hand up, and I'm going to ask to turn on your camera so that you could start your video if you want to, and then we'll follow that up with Tom Herzog. So Trudy first.
Oh, sorry, I was trying to unmute.
Oh, no problem. Great.
We moved to California when we were young, but in 8th grade, my teacher, Mrs. McGlashan, her grandfather wrote a book,
Yes.
which I think is highly regarded. And so I read it, brought it home, and my whole family read it. And then we just got so involved in the story, and we went to Donner Lake and just, it really captivated us that summer.
Good. Thank you for sharing that. Mr. Herzog.
Here, okay. I just brought this out, but this is called the Donner Trail Rider. It was back written a number of years ago, but it's the diary of John Markle. Have you heard of John Markle, Christina?
No, I had not.
Okay, he was the only true and authentic account of the exact location of the route of the Donner Trail. He was my wife's great-great-great-grandfather way back there. And that diary is in the Auburn Library. I have a copy of it. I went and made a copy of it. I was real close to getting close to getting the original, because I would have liked to seen it end up in the state library. But Wendell Robbie had it up there in Auburn, and I was making contact with him, and then he died. But then the daughter got it, and I don't know whatever happened to it, but there was an original diary. But he did a diary, and his diary was done in 1849. I'm looking at some of the diary dates, May 15th, 1849, so it's out there, and it's something that a lot of people don't know about.
No, I'd never heard of that. That's amazing.
Great, thank you. And Larry's going to ask a question. After that, I'm going to ask some of the Historical Society members that I noticed are on the list to a question. Larry.
First of all, Christina, great overview. Enjoyed it. Complicated story, and you put it together in a nice fashion. I just wanted to make a quick comment. You were talking about, or the kids were talking about when they were leaving, and Ron, you can comment on this more than me because I've never taken the time to verify this, but they left from Springfield, Illinois. There happened to be another person there that was pretty famous in our history that they were neighbors with. The Reeds were from Springfield. That was Abraham Lincoln. They had talked to Lincoln about coming out, and apparently, and again, I've never verified this. Ron, if you can comment where the information comes from, that they had talked with Lincoln and they were interested, but I guess Mary didn't want to, and how history would have changed if they had come out. And supposedly the day that they left, the Lincolns were there to wave goodbye to the Reeds. Phenomenal story, and I don't know what the source for that is. Do you know, Ron?
Well, no, they just, that's from diary accounts and things like that. But yeah, he wanted to come to California, but he was doing his political career, starting his political career at that time. So he didn't come, but they had considered it, and he had said that he would retire. As a matter of fact, the day he was shot, they were out on a carriage ride, and Mary told the story that he wanted to come to California to see the gold fields after his term was up. But of course, he never made it.
And that all had to do with James Reed, apparently. Just one other quick thing. You were talking about who survived Christina. All of Tamsen's kids survived. Her own kids and George's kids, which is an amazing story that she kept them all alive and gave up herself in the long run. The other party, besides the Breens, that survived intact was the Reed party. And what's most amazing about that is James Reed. His odds were 2 out of 3 of dying because 2 out of 3 adult men died that were trapped. His odds of dying, if he hadn't have killed Snyder and been put out on the road by horse, he would have probably died. But he and his wife and their whole family survived and became very successful in California.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate that.
Serena made a comment earlier, which let me go back to it. She said, we read about Patty Reed's doll as well. She grew up in California. It overshadows all. She remembers both 3rd and 8th grade covering it. And then later she asks, how do you spell Markle? She writes it M-A-R-K-L-E of this diary. Is it that how it's spelled, or M-A-R-K-E-L? Do you know?
It'll be Tom.
Do you know the answer to that one, Tom? Or
I'm looking at it right now. Markle.
Okay.
Great.
Ellie. Okay.
And we have quite a few historical society people, including Larry Borio, who belongs to lots of groups down in LA. So this is a request to all of you. David Clyman from the LA Times is writing a book about California that is the diaries and letters from people of California. They're looking for original material that isn't always shown. Christina had some of these comments that are wonderful, that he was delighted because he's never seen them before. I'm going to put my name in on the chat. And if anyone is from a historical society would like more information, I will send you a letter from him that you can distribute to your historical societies. He's hoping to get diary entries from all 58 counties in California. So I'm going to put that in. Does anyone else have another question or want to make a comment while I'm doing that? Christina, while I'm typing, you can say something.
Tom's hand
Okay,
is up.
I will. Whose hand is up? Tom.
Well, I
Tom.
apparently did take it down, but getting back to what you're talking about, there is a book that John Markle has written in, and I believe it has a bunch of diary quotes in it. I have the book. I went and looked in my library. It's buried in one of the second shelves, so it'll take me a little while to find it. But when I get it, I'll get it to Mary Ellen and she can pass it on. But it's not very popular book, but I bought it up at Tahoe Truckee up
Which
there
one
one
is it,
time.
Tom?
And
You kind of cut out when you said the name of the book.
I don't have the name of the book.
Oh,
I'm going to get it and I'm going to make a copy of it and send it to Mary Ellen, and then she can
Okay.
pass it on to everybody. And well,
Oh,
I have your email too, I think. So I'll
Yes.
pass it on. And also I'll pass on the information I have on the Markle. I have some, the article and some of the stuff, some of his quotes that was out of his diary. So I'll pass that on too.
thank you.
Great.
Very
And
much.
so also just a reminder that Christina is going to be doing another talk tomorrow for the Sacramento Historical Society. We have quite a few Sacramento Historical Society members with us tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for inviting me, even though you don't know that yet, to your next meeting so that I can make a pitch to become a full partner with the Renaissance Society for more programs like this. But do you want to talk about your program tomorrow, Christina, and how people could get access to it if they'd like to?
Yes, so go to the Sacramento Historical Society website, or you can pop into the Facebook page or links to register for the presentation. And this is all about the history of pandemics, and I call it the reputation of pandemics. And since I began to do this presentation last October, when COVID was thought to be a flu, and I reviewed all of the last flus. We've had 5 in 100 years and compared and contrasted. Well, now that we know COVID is no longer a flu, but just a virus, this particular presentation will be expanded to include all of the pandemics in the past 100 years. So that just blows open a whole new conversation about pandemics, about their effects on society, how long they last, what people do typically to get over them. The one little fun fact, and I'll end it with this, is I posted on my Facebook page a little ditty about the Spanish flu, and somebody said that their grandfather or great-grandfather had sworn by eating onions, and he didn't know if it's because people would stay away from him or if it was actually a cure. So of course, what I do is I go into newspapers.com and I start searching, and sure enough, onions and lemons make sense, were part of what they felt was a cure for Spanish flu. So fun little fun facts like that. I know it's kind of a dreary subject. I've got 2 dreary subjects right now, but we will have fun with it. It's a good subject to talk about right now, especially.
Good. And Barbara Gant said, and I thought I was fascinated with this, I'm a 6th-generation Californian and relative of John Nash, who married Lavina Graves, Donner Party survivor.
Oh, wow.
Highly recommend the book, The Indifferent Stars Above, The Saga of the Donner Party. So thank you. Kathy posts, and thank you so much. Everyone, please save the chat. You can save the chat by hitting the 3 little dots at the very, very bottom of the chat. We'll save all of the questions. And also our addresses for more virtual events given by Renaissance and partner organizations. Please check out this page for detail, and it's renaissancecafesacramento.com/events. I'm going to put in a plug for myself. I'm going to be giving a talk on Wednesday on Food on the Page. And it is the story of menus and cookbooks, a lot of them centering specifically on the many Sacramento cookbooks that are menus that I have with personal stories as well. And then on Thursday, with bits and pieces that Kathy is coordinating, we are also going to have a book arts class called Improvisation. So there's tons and tons of projects. Please check out our website and our Renaissance page. If you are with the Eventbrite, you will also get a link to this program. And I'm going to send you a link to Christina's earlier talk, which was on pandemics, different from the one tomorrow. And I will send you the information for signing up for her next program as well. Before I stop the recording, Christina, is there any last words you'd like to make?
Well, thank you again, Mary Ellen. I love working with the Renaissance Society. I love all of the subjects. My next presentation will be about early Roseville, in a little town they call Junction. And since I was president of the Historical Society in Roseville for quite a while, I have a lot of fun slides on that one and a lot of detail on that one too. So railroad fans, Roseville fans, Placer County fans, it'll be a fun talk. But thank you. This is fantastic. And history's fantastic.
Good. And before I close recording, one more comment. I'll stop the recording, but we always give about 5 minutes after to kind of just wind down for people who are too shy to talk. But again, there are a lot of other historical societies are here. We invite anyone who is in the audience that would like to give a presentation in the evening, during the day, a short one, brown bag lunches or bits and pieces under an hour, please notify us and we'd love to get you scheduled. So again, thank you, Christina, and everyone else for attending.
Thank you.